You're just the deal carrying my air.
Enjoy my bed tonight. By morning, you won't own this house or your empire.
This marriage is a formality, Noelle. Nothing more. My secretary already runs my calendar, my house, and my bed. I'd learn the difference between a wife and a witness pretty fast if I were you. Noelle Bennett walked into her wedding night 3 months pregnant and already lied to. She'd thought she understood exactly what she was signing up for when she agreed to marry Julian Cross. She did not expect him to say the quiet part out loud. On this night, in his grandmother's old bedroom, with the ink on the marriage license barely dry, what she was carrying and what she had been carrying in silence for a lot longer than 3 months was about to become the only leverage she had left in a house that wanted her gone. The room still smelled like the flowers from downstairs, white peonies going soft at the edges in vases. Nobody had thought to refresh, and Noelle Bennett stood in the middle of it in a wedding dress she had bought off the rack because there hadn't been time for anything else, waiting for her husband of 6 hours to say something that wasn't about the merger. "You should sit down," Julian said instead. He hadn't taken off his jacket. He hadn't crossed the room. He stood by the door of his grandmother's old bedroom, the one with the reading chair Eleanor Cross had died in, and the wallpaper nobody in the family had ever agreed to replace, and he looked at Noelle the way he might look at a line item he intended to cut. "We should be clear about what tonight is and isn't." "I'm aware of what tonight is," she said. "Then you're aware this room is a formality, too." His voice had the flat courtesy of a man reciting terms he'd rehearsed in the car. "My secretary already runs my calendar, my house, and my bed. I'd learn the difference between a wife and a witness pretty fast if I were you." She did not answer right away. Downstairs, the last of the 11 guests, not the 400 the society page had assumed there'd be, were being walked to their cars by staff who had been told, in the specific language the Cross family used for things it didn't want discussed, to keep the evening quiet. Larchfield sat on 11 acres in Greenwich, a house built in 1912 by a man who wanted Connecticut to look at him and see permanence, and tonight it had done exactly what it was built to do. It had made a wedding between two people who could barely stand in the same room together look, from the outside, like something worth writing about. "I heard you," Noelle said finally. "I don't need it repeated." Something in his jaw moved, a small tightening she recognized from 18 months ago, back when she used to be close enough to watch him do it over a conference table and think it was a habit she liked. It wasn't. It was the tell of a man deciding in real time whether to say something crueler than what he'd already said. He decided against it, which she supposed was meant to be a mercy. "Vanessa has the guest list for the shareholder dinner Thursday," he said, already turning for the door. "If you're going to be photographed as my wife in public, you'll coordinate with her on what that looks like." "Coordinate with her," Noelle repeated. "She runs the parts of my life that require running." He said it without heat, which was worse than if he'd said it with any. "That's not new information, Noelle. You were around long enough to know how this house works." She had been around once for almost a year, close enough to know exactly how the house worked, and he was right, that it wasn't new information. What was new was hearing it said to her face. On the one night, a woman was traditionally allowed to expect something better than a schedule. He left. The door closed with the particular weight of old hardware, a click and then a settling, and Noelle stood alone in a room that had belonged to a dead woman she'd never met, in a dress she'd have to have altered again in a month, because her body was already starting to change shape around a secret nobody in this house knew she was keeping. She let herself have exactly 1 full minute of it. She sat down on the edge of the bed, put one hand flat against her stomach, 3 months along and only just beginning to show if you knew to look, and breathed until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to think clearly again. She had done harder things than survive one cruel sentence from a man grieving a grandfather he didn't know how to grieve properly. She reminded herself of that the way she reminded herself of most things now, like a fact retrieved from a file, rather than a feeling she was allowed to sit inside of. 18 months ago, she had been a different version of herself, a forensic accountant 6 years into a career at a small downtown firm called Corrigan and Voss, the kind of place that got hired for due diligence work nobody wanted their name attached to. Augustus Cross had hired her personally, quietly, structuring her engagement as a vendor compliance review so specific and so boring that nobody on the Cross Capital Board thought to ask a second question about it. He had not told her, at first, what he actually suspected. He had told her only to look carefully at 3 years of vendor payments running through a subsidiary nobody paid much attention to, and to tell him what she found without telling anyone else first. What she had found, slowly, over months of late nights with a laptop and a company badge that said vendor compliance and nothing else, was a pattern she still hadn't finished tracing the day Augustus died. She had also, in that same year, fallen in love with his grandson, which had not been part of the engagement, and which Augustus had eventually, gently, asked her to stop doing, not because he disapproved, because he was afraid, in the specific way a dying man gets afraid for the people he's leaving unfinished business to, that if Julian found out what she was actually doing inside his own company before she'd finished doing it, someone would get hurt, and it might be her. She had left without explaining why. 14 months ago now, she had told Julian nothing because there had been nothing she was allowed to tell him, and she had spent the drive back into the city that night crying in a way she had not let herself cry since, and she had told herself it was the right call because Augustus Cross, whatever else he was, had never once been wrong about how to protect the people he actually cared about. He had died 8 months ago, and 3 months after that, at a memorial dinner neither of them had wanted to attend alone, grief had done what grief does to two people who never finished a conversation, and Noelle had ended up in a hotel room with Julian Cross for one night that neither of them had planned and both of them had needed. And 9 weeks later, a doctor had told her, in the specific tone doctors use when they know the next sentence is going to change someone's life, that she was pregnant, and that given her blood pressure history, it was something they'd want to monitor closely. She had not told Julian that last part either. Not yet. There hadn't been a version of the conversation that didn't sound, from the outside, exactly like what Vanessa Sloan had apparently already convinced him it was. Noelle stood up from the bed, straightened the dress out of habit, and walked to the window. Below her, the last car pulled down the long gravel drive, its headlights sweeping briefly across the hedge line before the dark swallowed it. Somewhere in this house, in a locked room off the east hallway that had been Augustus's private study, there was a drawer she had been told about exactly once by a lawyer named Preston Ames, who had read her a will clause in a conference room 7 months ago, and then handed her a small brass key across the table without any further explanation, saying only that Augustus Cross had asked him to give it to her personally when the time came, and that the time, in Preston's professional opinion, was probably going to be her wedding night. She had the key in the lining of her handbag. She had carried it through her own wedding without telling a single person it existed. She left the bridal suite in her stocking feet, dress shoes abandoned by the bed, and walked the east hallway the way she remembered it from a year and a half ago, past the portrait of Eleanor Cross that Julian had once told her he found unbearable to look at because his grandmother's eyes had a way of following a person across a room, past the closed door of Augustus's old bedroom, and to the study at the end of the hall where the desk still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco. Augustus had smoked right up until his doctors made him stop. The drawer was where Preston had said it would be, second from the bottom on the left side of the desk, and the key turned in the lock with a small, precise click that felt, in the quiet of the empty study, like the loudest sound in the house. Inside was a laminated identification card from a firm she'd never worked for, Ashcombe Advisory Partners, with her photograph on it, and a name that wasn't hers, Noelle Hale, and a start date that predated her actual engagement with Corrigan and Voss by nearly a year. Underneath it was an envelope, unsealed, her real name written on the front in Augustus's handwriting, the same careful, old-fashioned script she remembered from the margins of the files he used to send her. She unfolded the letter and read the first lines standing up, because she found she couldn't make herself sit down for this. "If you're reading this," it said, "then I'm gone, and Julian has married you, which means the clause worked exactly the way I needed it to. I am sorry for what that sentence probably feels like from where you're standing. I did not build this to punish either of you. I built it because I ran out of time to finish something myself, and you were the only person I trusted enough to leave it with." She stopped there, folded the letter along its original crease, and put it back in the envelope. There would be time to read the rest of it. There was a version of tonight that involved sitting in this chair until she'd absorbed every word Augustus Cross had left her, and there was a version that involved doing the thing she actually needed to do before anyone in this house. Remembered she now had a set of house keys and a wedding ring, and, as of this morning, a login to the Cross Capital internal server that someone was eventually going to think to revoke. She went to the terminal in the study's side alcove instead, the one Augustus had used for years to keep an eye on the company from home, still logged into a guest account. Nobody had bothered to disable since his death, and she pulled up the vendor compliance files she had spent the better part of a year building, without anyone ever seeing the finished version. She copied what mattered onto a small encrypted drive she'd brought in her handbag beside the key, the same drive she'd used at Corrigan and Voss for exactly this kind of insurance, because some habits from a career built on protecting yourself from powerful clients didn't go away just because you'd married one. She was halfway through the transfer when a line in the most recent quarter's file caught her attention, a vendor code she didn't recognize, routed through an account that hadn't existed the last time she'd reviewed this ledger 7 months ago, moving money in amounts too small to trigger any audit flag and too regular to be anything but deliberate. She sat very still for a moment, looking at it. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed, footsteps moving with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in 6 years worried about being asked what she was doing in this house at midnight. Noelle closed the file, pocketed the drive, and did not move from the desk until the footsteps had passed. Chapter 2. Marta Kowalski had worked at Larchfield for 11 years, long enough to know exactly how the house was supposed to sound at 7 in the morning, and long enough to notice, without anyone telling her, that the new Mrs. Cross hadn't managed to keep down more than dry toast in 3 days. "Ginger tea," Marta said, setting the cup down at Noelle's elbow in the small breakfast room off the kitchen, the one the family used when there weren't guests to perform for. "Not the mint. Mint made it worse for my sister both times. Ginger's gentler." "Thank you," Noelle said, and meant it more than the 2 words probably conveyed. It was the first kind thing anyone in this house had done for her since she'd arrived, and she found herself blinking harder than the moment warranted. "You're not the first young wife I've watched come into this family looking like she hadn't slept," Marta said, not unkindly, wiping down a counter that didn't need it. Won't be the last either, probably. Just drink the tea. She was still there, refilling the cup, when Vanessa Sloan walked in without knocking. Because Vanessa Sloan did not knock on doors in a house she had effectively run for 6 years. Marta. Vanessa's voice had the pleasant, carrying quality of someone who wanted to be heard by more than the person she was addressing. I need you to explain why there's a service charge on last month's household account for a prenatal specialist consultation. Nobody authorized that. Mr. Cross's grandfather's old physician recommended her, Marta said. Mrs. Cross asked me to arrange the car. Mrs. Cross doesn't arrange anything in this house without it coming through me first. That's not new, Marta. You've worked here long enough to know how requests get authorized. Vanessa's eyes moved to Noel for exactly as long as it took to make the point, then back to Marta. You're going to want to be more careful about whose instructions you take at face value going forward. I was trying to help, Marta said. I understand that. I do. Vanessa's tone didn't change at all, which was somehow worse than if it had sharpened. But this house doesn't run on people trying to help. It runs on people following the structure that's in place. I'll have payroll finalize your severance by Friday. The kitchen went very quiet. One of the younger staff, a boy plating fruit at the far counter, stopped moving entirely. You're firing me, Marta said, for bringing her tea. I'm letting you go for repeatedly overstepping the boundaries of your role, Vanessa said. This isn't a discussion. Noelle stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor loud enough that everyone in the room heard it. She works for this family. Not for you. Everyone in this kitchen works for Cross Capital, which pays this household's staffing budget, which I manage. Vanessa's smile arrived and departed with mechanical precision. I'm sure Julian explained the structure to you last night. I'd hate for there to be any more confusion about it. Noelle looked at Marta, who was already untying her apron with the resigned efficiency of someone who had seen this exact scene play out before, for someone else, in some other kitchen, in some other year, and had learned there was no version of arguing that changed the outcome. I'm sorry, Noelle said quietly to Marta, because it was the only thing she had that was actually hers to give. Don't be, Marta said. Wasn't your fault. Drink the tea before it goes cold. She left through the service hallway without looking back, and nobody in the kitchen said anything for a long moment after the door swung shut behind her. That was unnecessary, Noelle said. It was structural, Vanessa said. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one from where you're sitting. She picked an invisible thread off her sleeve, a small, habitual gesture Noelle remembered from a year and a half ago, back when Vanessa had been merely irritating rather than something closer to dangerous. Speaking of structure, your appointment this afternoon has been moved. Dr. Alvarez's office called. Some scheduling conflict on their end. They'll reach out to reschedule. Move to when? I didn't ask for specifics. It's a rescheduling matter, not something that needed to come through me, honestly, except the car service does, and I canceled the car since there was no longer an appointment to drive you to. Vanessa checked her phone, the conversation apparently already closed in her mind. Julian's in Zurich until Thursday, by the way, in case you were wondering whether to expect him at dinner. He asked me to let you know. She left the way she'd entered, without waiting for a response, and Noelle sat back down slowly, the tea in front of her gone lukewarm, and thought about the fact that she had confirmed that appointment herself twice over the phone 4 days ago, and that Dr. Alvarez's office was not in the habit of canceling high-risk follow-ups on same-day notice without at least attempting to reach the patient directly first. She called the office anyway, from her cell, standing at the window of the breakfast room where the light was better. The receptionist who answered sounded confused in a way that told Noelle everything she needed to know before the woman even finished the sentence. "We didn't cancel anything on our end, Mrs. Cross. We actually tried reaching the house twice yesterday to confirm today's time, and were told you'd call back." "Nobody told me that," Noelle said. "I'm sorry to hear that. Would you like to come in this afternoon as originally scheduled?" "Yes," Noelle said. "Please." She hung up and stood there for a moment with the phone still in her hand, looking out at the hedge line where last night's headlights had swept across the dark, and she thought, not for the first time since arriving at Larchfield, that she had spent a year of her professional life tracing exactly this kind of small, deliberate discrepancy through much larger sums of money, and she recognized the shape of it now in something as ordinary as a canceled car service. She drove herself. Dr. Alvarez, a calm, precise woman in her 50s, who had clearly seen every version of a stressed patient trying to hold herself together in an exam room, took Noelle's blood pressure twice, waited, and took it a third time. "It's elevated," Dr. Alvarez said. "Not dangerously, not yet, but higher than I'd like to see at this stage. Especially given your history. Are you under unusual stress right now?" "Some," Noelle said. "I'd like you to start monitoring it daily. If you get a headache that doesn't respond to rest, any vision changes, swelling that comes on fast rather than gradually, I want you in an emergency room immediately, not waiting for an appointment." "Do you have someone at home who can watch for that with you?" Noelle thought about the empty house she was going back to, about Julian somewhere over the Atlantic on his way to Zurich, about Vanessa managing the structure of things from an office 2 floors below the bedroom where Noelle would be sleeping alone tonight. "I'll watch it myself," she said. She spent the drive back turning over the wire codes from the study, the vendor account that hadn't existed 7 months ago, the careful smallness of the amounts, because it was easier to think about numbers than about the tightness that had settled behind her eyes sometime after lunch and hadn't fully gone away. By 10 that night, the tightness had become a headache unlike any she'd had before, a pressure behind her right eye that made the bedside lamp look like it had a halo around it, and when she stood up to get water, the room tilted in a way rooms weren't supposed to tilt. She sat back down on the edge of the bed, breathed, reached for her phone. The numbers on the cuff Dr. Alvarez had sent home with her that afternoon read high enough that Noelle, who had spent a career learning to read numbers and understand exactly what they meant, felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with Julian or Vanessa or any of it. She called for a car instead of driving herself this time because some part of her, even frightened, was still thinking clearly enough to know she shouldn't be behind a wheel, and by the time the car reached the emergency room at Greenwich Hospital, her vision had a soft, static edge to it that hadn't been there an hour before. They took her back fast. That was the part she remembered most clearly afterward. How fast the calm, efficient motion started. The moment someone read her blood pressure off the triage cuff, how a nurse's expression changed and didn't change back, how quickly the room filled with people were speaking to each other in the clipped shorthand of professionals who understood something was serious before the patient had fully absorbed that it was. "We're going to get this under control," a doctor told her, a young man with tired eyes and a steady voice, an IV already going into the back of her hand. "Your pressure's high enough that we're watching closely for preeclampsia. The baby's heart rate looks good right now, and that's the most important thing, but I need you to stay very still and let us work." "Is the baby okay?" Noelle asked, and heard her own voice come out smaller than she meant it to. "Right now, yes. That's what we're working to keep true." Julian arrived at 11:40, still in the suit he'd worn onto the plane, his tie loosened, his face the particular gray of a man who had been given very little information over the phone and had spent the drive from the airport filling in the worst of it himself. "What happened?" he said, not really a question, standing at the foot of the bed with his hands not knowing what to do with themselves. Her blood pressure spiked, the doctor said, since Noelle was still hooked to a monitor, and answering questions felt, at that particular moment, like more effort than she had available. "We're managing it. She's stable. We're keeping her overnight for observation, possibly longer, depending on how the numbers respond." "She has a heart condition?" "A blood pressure history that made this pregnancy higher risk from the start," the doctor said, glancing at his chart. She had a monitoring appointment scheduled for this afternoon that would have caught the trend earlier. According to her chart, it was rescheduled and then reinstated same day. "I'd recommend keeping appointments like that consistent going forward." Julian's eyes moved to Noelle. "Rescheduled by who?" "I don't know," Noelle said, which was true in the sense that she hadn't confirmed it, and false in the sense that she was fairly certain she did. He didn't ask again. He pulled the single chair in the room closer to the bed and sat down in it. And for a while, neither of them said anything. The only sound, the steady electronic rhythm of the monitor, tracking something that mattered more than either of their pride. "You could have called me," he said eventually. "You were in Zurich. I'd have turned the plane around." "Would you have?" Noelle said, not as an accusation, just tired enough that the question came out flat and honest instead of sharp. He didn't answer that either, and she understood, watching him sit there not answering it, that some part of him wasn't sure himself, and that the not being sure was its own kind of answer. "The car service for my appointment today was canceled," she said, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry past the curtain. "The doctor's office says they never canceled anything on their end. Somebody told them I'd call back. I never got that message." Vanessa mentioned there'd been a scheduling issue. There wasn't one. Not on my side, and not on the doctor's side, which leaves one place it could have come from. Julian was quiet for a long moment, looking at the monitor rather than at her, watching numbers he didn't fully understand tick through their steady rhythm. "She's run this house for 6 years without a single mistake like that. I'm not saying it was a mistake." He looked at her then, and something in his face for the first time, since the wedding night wasn't performance, wasn't the flat courtesy of rehearsed terms, but something closer to a man actually listening to a sentence and turning it over rather than deciding in advance what it meant. "I need you to be careful what you're implying, Noelle." "I'm not implying anything I can't prove yet," she said, and closed her eyes because the headache was still sitting behind her right eye like a fist, and because some things were better left said until she actually had the proof sitting in front of her, instead of scattered across a laptop and a small encrypted drive hidden in the lining of her handbag. He stayed the rest of the night. He didn't reach for her hand, and she didn't ask him to, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, when the numbers on the monitor had finally begun to settle into something the nursing staff seemed satisfied with, she opened her eyes and found him still in the chair, awake, watching the machine rather than her, his jaw set in the particular way she remembered from a year and a half ago, back when she used to think that expression meant he was working through a problem he intended to solve. She hoped, lying there in the flat hospital light with her hand resting on the small curve of her stomach, that it still meant that. She was no longer entirely sure. She came home from the hospital on a Thursday with a folder of discharge instructions, a bottle of medication to manage her blood pressure, and strict orders to rest, and she spent the following 4 days doing exactly none of the resting and all of the tracing she'd started the night of her wedding. Julian had stayed 2 more days before flying back to Zurich to close what remained of the deal he'd left mid-negotiation, and the house had gone quiet again in the particular way it always seemed to, settling back into its usual rhythms. The moment nobody with real authority was around to notice what those rhythms actually were. Noelle worked from the small office off the West Wing that had once belonged to Augustus's assistant, a room nobody used anymore, with a door that locked and a window that looked out over the rose garden rather than the drive, which meant she could see anyone approaching from the house before they saw her. She had read the rest of Augustus's letter by then, twice, and had committed to memory the two sentences that mattered most. I built the audit clause into the marriage settlement because I could not put you on the company payroll without every question that would raise. I needed someone inside who owed the family nothing except the truth, and you were the only person who had already proven she'd tell it to me even when it cost her something. The vendor account she'd found the night of the wedding, the one that hadn't existed 7 months ago, had a name attached to it now. A shell entity called Faro Municipal Consulting, registered in Delaware, with a business address that turned out, when she looked it up, to be a mailbox rental store in Wilmington. The payments moving through it were small, never more than $11,000 at a time, spaced out over irregular intervals that would never trip an automated flag, but that added up over 7 months to just under $300,000. What she found on the 4th day of tracing stopped her cold. The authorization on the account, the digital signature required to approve a new vendor relationship above the $10,000 threshold, belonged to Julian. She sat with that for a long time, the cursor blinking on the screen, the number staring back at her, and she made herself go through it the way Augustus had trained her to go through anything that looked too clean. Signatures could be real. They could also be spoofed, copied from an old document, applied through system access that had nothing to do with the person whose name appeared. She pulled the metadata on the approval, the login credentials attached to the transaction, and found they traced to an internal account that had been active at 2 in the morning on a night 7 months ago. A night she checked against Julian's calendar and found he'd been in Singapore, 14 hours ahead, very much not awake, and very much not sitting at a cross-capital terminal in Greenwich. Someone had used his login, which meant someone had his credentials or access to a system that made faking them possible. And there was exactly one person at Larchfield with both the technical access and the years of quiet trust required to pull that off without anyone thinking to check. She didn't have proof yet that it was Vanessa. She had proof that it wasn't. Couldn't be Julian. And for a moment, sitting alone in that small office, with the rose garden going gray outside the window, she felt something loosen in her chest that had nothing to do with blood pressure and everything to do with the fact that some part of her, some part she hadn't let herself examine too closely, had spent 4 days afraid the man she'd married might actually be capable of this. She was still sitting with that relief when someone knocked, once, and opened the door before she could answer. "You've been in here a lot," Vanessa said, stepping in without being asked, closing the door behind her with a soft, deliberate click. "Marta used to use this office before. Now it's you." "I find that a little sentimental, honestly. I didn't realize the office assignments needed clearing with you, too." "They don't. I just notice things. It's sort of my job." Vanessa's eyes moved across the desk, the closed laptop, the folder of discharge papers still sitting where Noelle had left them. "How are you feeling?" "That was frightening, what happened at the hospital. I felt terrible about it." "Did you?" "Of course. Whatever else you think of me, I don't want anything bad to happen to a pregnancy under this roof. That would be a strange thing to want." Vanessa moved to the window, looked out at the roses the way someone looks at something they own. "I did want to mention, since we're talking, that Preston Ames called the house this morning. He's been trying to reach you directly. something about the marriage settlement documentation. I told him you'd been unwell and I'd pass along the message. You didn't pass it along until now. I'm passing it along now." Vanessa turned back, and her expression had the pleasant, unhurried quality of someone who had said something far more pointed than the words themselves suggested. "You should call him back. I believe it's time sensitive." "Noelle, can I say something to you honestly?" One woman to another. "You can say whatever you'd like. I've watched a lot of young women come into this family thinking they understood what they were walking into. Most of them didn't last very long, and it wasn't because anyone was cruel to them. Exactly. It's because this family doesn't forgive people who go looking for things that aren't theirs to find. Augustus was the same way, even with people he trusted, especially with people he trusted, actually." Vanessa smiled, small and even. "I'd hate to see you spend your last months of pregnancy chasing something that ends up costing you more than it's worth." Is that a threat? It's advice. From someone who's been in this house a lot longer than you have, and intends to stay in it a lot longer than you might. Vanessa checked her phone, unhurried. "Call Preston. Today, if you can manage it." She left the way she always left, without waiting to see what landed, and Noelle sat very still in the quiet after the door closed, her hand resting flat against her stomach out of habit, now more than worry, thinking that whatever Preston Ames had to say, it was not going to be good news, because good news did not usually get passed along through Vanessa Sloan with that particular tone attached to it. She called him within the hour. Preston's voice on the phone had none of its usual courtroom calm. "Noelle, I'm glad you called back. I need to tell you something before you hear it from anyone else in that house." A pause, the sound of a door closing on his end, someone wanting privacy for what came next. Julian's attorney filed paperwork this morning to begin the process of annulment. The grounds cited are fraud in the inducement of marriage, specifically that you entered the union under false professional pretenses, that Augustus's estate concealed from Julian at the time of the wedding. Noelle sat down slowly in the chair she'd already been sitting in, the sensation of the floor shifting beneath her, having nothing to do with blood pressure this time. "He's filing to annul the marriage. His attorney is. I don't know that Julian himself has seen the final language yet, but it went out under his signature authorization this morning, which means at minimum he approved the filing." Preston's voice tightened. "Noelle, if this goes through before the settlement clause activates fully, you lose the protections Augustus built into it. The audit access, the standing to bring what you found forward with any legal weight, all of it. When did this go out?" "This morning, 9:40, according to the filing stamp." 9:40 that morning was roughly the time Noelle realized that Vanessa had been standing in this exact doorway telling her with that same pleasant, unhurried voice that Preston had a message worth returning promptly. "Preston, I need you to check something for me. The vendor account, Faro Municipal Consulting, the one I flagged for you last month. I found the authorization signature on the account. It's logged as Julian's, but the login activity traces to a night he was in Singapore, 14 hours off, nowhere near a terminal in Greenwich." There was a pause on the line long enough that Noelle wondered if the call had dropped. "Say that again," Preston said. "Someone used Julian's credentials to authorize a shell vendor relationship while he was overseas and physically incapable of making that login. $300,000 has moved through that account in the last 7 months. Do you have the metadata pulled?" "I have it saved. I have all of it saved, actually, going back to the night of the wedding." Another pause, shorter this time, and when Preston spoke again, his voice had shifted into something more careful, the tone of a man recalculating the shape of a case in real time. "Noelle, listen to me carefully. If someone forged Julian's authorization to move company funds, and that same someone is now moving to have your marriage annulled before you can bring that forward with legal standing, that is not a coincidence. That is someone trying to eliminate the one person positioned to expose them before she's able to do it. I know, do not go to Julian with half of this, not yet. If his attorney has already filed based on information someone fed them, you need the full picture before you walk into that room, or you hand them the exact narrative they're building. An unstable audit consultant making increasingly desperate accusations to save a marriage of convenience. How long do I have? The filing gives Julian's side 30 days to finalize documentation before it goes in front of a judge. That's not much time, but it's something. Preston exhaled audibly. I'm going to pull everything on Faro Municipal Consulting's self independently, so there's a paper trail that doesn't run through your login exclusively. Send me what you have tonight through the secure channel, not email. I will. And Noel. His voice softened, just slightly, the first crack in the professional register since he'd picked up the phone. Augustus told me once that the day would probably come when you'd be standing exactly here, doing exactly this alone, with everyone in that house convinced you were the problem instead of the solution. He said if that day came, I should remind you that he chose you because you don't flinch. So don't. She thanked him and hung up and sat for a while in the small office with the light going fully gray outside the window and thought about the fact that somewhere in this house, possibly in the next room, was a filing that would end her marriage on paper before she'd had the chance to prove the one thing that would actually end it in truth. She opened her laptop again and went back to the transaction records because there was nothing else productive to do with the fear sitting in her chest except turn it into work, and 2 hours later, cross-referencing the Faro Municipal Consulting payments against Crossed Capital's active vendor contracts, she found the thread that made everything else make sense. Faro Municipal Consulting wasn't just a shell company receiving small, irregular payments. It was, according to a public records filing, she found buried 3 layers deep, a registered subsidiary of a holding company called Ashgrove Partners, which itself, going back one more layer, resolved to a name Noel recognized instantly from 4 years of reading trade press during her time at Corrigan and Voss. Halloway Dynamics, Cross Capital's largest competitor in the infrastructure sector, currently, according to the financial press, in the early quiet stages of what analysts were calling an unsolicited approach toward a controlling stake, an approach the board had so far declined to comment on. Someone inside Cross Capital had been feeding money out through Julian's forged authorization into a shell company owned by the very firm trying to take the company over, which meant someone inside Cross Capital had also, almost certainly, been feeding Halloway information in the other direction, information about vendor contracts, board sentiment, whatever internal detail made a hostile approach easier to time correctly. Noel sat back in the chair, the pieces settling into a shape she recognized with a kind of exhausted clarity, because she had spent a career learning exactly this shape, money moving quietly in one direction, information moving quietly in the other, both directions converging on someone who benefited from both the money and the deal it was funding. She had 30 days before the annulment filing reached a judge. She had a husband on the other side of an ocean who did not yet know any of it. And she had exactly one card left that Vanessa Sloan did not know she'd found. Noel picked up her phone and called Preston back, even though it was close to midnight, because the alternative was going to sleep with what she now suspected and doing nothing about it until morning. And morning felt like it might already be too late. Preston answered on the second ring, alert in the way of a man half expecting the call. She told him what she'd found. She told him she wanted to file for an emergency stay on the annulment, proceeding first thing in the morning, using the wire evidence directly before anyone in that house had the chance to bury it any deeper than it already was. Preston was quiet for a moment. "That tips our hand 3 weeks earlier than I wanted to," he said. "The second we file, whoever did this will know exactly how much we've found and how fast we found it." "I know. Are you certain you want to move that early?" She looked at her own reflection in the dark window, tired in a way that went past exhaustion, and certain in a way she hadn't expected to feel this late into a night that had already asked so much of her. "I'm certain," she said. "File it in the morning." Julian came home from Zurich 4 days early, and he did not call ahead. Noelle heard the car on the gravel before she heard anything else, and she stood at the window of the small office with the file she'd built over the last 3 days, sitting closed on the desk behind her, and watched him get out of the car alone without his usual driver, moving fast across the drive in the particular way of a man who had made a decision somewhere over the Atlantic and didn't want time to talk himself out of it. She met him in the front hall. "I need to talk to you," he said, before she could say anything about the filing. "I know about the filing." That stopped him. "Preston told you." Preston had to. "Someone filed to annul our marriage without so much as a conversation first. Julian, I found out from your lawyer's paperwork before I found out from you." She kept her voice level because level was the only register that was going to get her through the next hour, and because she had learned over a year of reading Julian Cross's cross conference tables that he responded to composure the way other people responded to volume. "Did you read the filing before your name went on it?" "I authorized my attorney to prepare it as a precaution. I didn't authorize it to go out. There's a difference. Not one that matters much to a judge. I know that." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered from a year and a half ago, back when it used to mean he was working through something difficult rather than deciding how much to blame himself for it. "I got a call this morning. Vanessa said the filing had gone out ahead of schedule, some miscommunication with the attorney's office. I told her to pull it back immediately and got on a plane." "You told her to pull it back?" "Yes. And has it been pulled?" He didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "Come with me," Noelle said. "There's something you need to see, and I'd rather show you than tell you. Because I think you're going to want to see the numbers yourself before you decide whether to believe me." They walked together to the small office off the West Wing, and she was aware, the whole way there, of how strange it felt to be leading her own husband through his own house, like a guest who needed directions, and how strange it felt, underneath that, to realize she trusted this version of him, tired and rattled, and having flown across an ocean without warning his own staff, more than she'd trusted the version who'd stood in the bridal suite 4 days ago reciting terms about a bed. She opened the laptop and turned it so the screen faced him. "Faro Municipal Consulting," she said. "A vendor account that didn't exist 7 months ago. $300,000 has moved through it since, in amounts small enough to avoid an audit flag. The authorization on the account is logged under your digital signature." Julian leaned forward, reading. "I've never heard of this company. I know you haven't, because the login used to authorize it traces to a night 7 months ago when you were in Singapore, 14 hours off Greenwich time, physically incapable of being at a terminal here." She let that sit for a second before continuing, watching him absorb it. "Someone used your credentials. Someone with enough access to this house's systems and enough years of trust built up around them that nobody thought to double-check. That's not possible. My login requires a physical key fob, not just a password. Which means whoever did this had access to your fob, or a duplicate of it, on a night you were out of the country and wouldn't notice it missing. She clicked forward to the next screen. I traced the ownership on Faro Municipal Consulting 3 layers deep. It resolves to a holding company called Ashgrove Partners. Ashgrove Partners is a subsidiary of Holloway Dynamics. Julian went very still. Your competitor? Noel said, currently making a quiet run at a controlling stake in this company. Someone inside Cross Capital has been feeding money to a Holloway shell account under your forged authorization, and I'd bet everything I have that the same person has been feeding Holloway information in the other direction. Vendor contracts, board sentiment, whatever they needed to time this correctly. Do you have proof of who? Not documentary proof yet, but I have a very short list of people in this house with both the access and the years of trust required to pull off something like this without anyone questioning it. She met his eyes. And I have a filing on your desk, dated this morning, that would have ended our marriage and stripped me of the exact legal standing Augustus built into our settlement specifically so I could bring this forward. Someone timed that filing very precisely, Julian, right after I found this account, right before I could act on it. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the screen, and she watched something shift behind his eyes. The particular recalibration of a man being asked to consider that the person he trusted most in his own house might not deserve it. Vanessa's had access to my systems for years, he said slowly. Administrative access. She manages onboarding for new vendor contracts. She'd have the technical ability. I'm not asking you to take my word for the accusation, Noel said. I'm asking you to look at the account yourself and decide what the evidence actually says. The door opened. Vanessa stood in the doorway, and for a fraction of a second, before her expression settled back into its usual composed pleasantness, Noel watched something cross her face that she recognized instantly from a career spent watching people realize in real time that the version of events they'd built was collapsing. Julian, Vanessa said, you're back early. I was going to call you the moment your flight landed. There's been some confusion with the filing. I can explain. Sit down, Julian said. I don't think that's necessary. Whatever she's shown you, I can explain the account. It's a routine vendor arrangement. There's nothing to it. Vanessa. His voice hadn't risen, but something in it had changed register entirely. The tone of a man who had stopped extending the benefit of the doubt. Faro Municipal Consulting. Explain it to me. It's a small consulting vendor, environmental compliance work for the Wilmington facility. I set it up under a standard vendor agreement, using my authorization credentials on a night I was in Singapore. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed once before she found words again. Systems glitch. It happens more than you'd think. The authentication server occasionally logs the wrong account. Faro Municipal Consulting is a subsidiary of Ashgrove Partners, Noel said, quiet and even, letting the silence that followed do more work than her voice could. Ashgrove Partners is a subsidiary of Holloway Dynamics. The room went very still. Vanessa did not say anything for several seconds, and in those seconds her face did something Noel had never seen it do before, a kind of visible internal scramble, the practiced pleasantness dropping away to something rawer underneath. Before the mask came back up, thinner now, less convincing. That's a coincidence of corporate structure, Vanessa said. Holding companies own dozens of subsidiaries. It doesn't mean anything. It means $300,000 of cross-capital money has been moving into an account controlled by the company currently trying to take this business over, Julian said. And it means someone used my credentials to authorize it while I was on the other side of the planet. I would never do that to you. I'd like to believe that, Julian said. And something in his voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than shouting would have been. I've believed a lot of things you've told me over the years, Vanessa, about this house, about her. He didn't look at Noelle when he said it, but she felt the weight of the sentence land anyway. I think I'd like to see your login history for the last 7 months, all of it. Tonight, you don't have the authority to compel that. Without board approval, Vanessa said, and her voice had changed too, the pleasant register gone entirely, something harder and faster underneath it. I've run this house, this family's affairs, for 6 years. I know where every account is. I know things about this family that would take you months to untangle without me, before you decide to burn that down over a filing error and some accountant's speculation. Forensic accountant, Noelle said. And it's not speculation. It's a paper trail with your fingerprints on the routing, whether you left them there on purpose or not. Vanessa turned to look at her directly for the first time since walking in, and whatever remained of the pleasant mask was gone now, replaced by something colder and more assessing, a woman doing rapid math on how much damage was actually in front of her. You have no idea what you've walked into, Vanessa said, very quietly, to Noelle. None. You think you found something clever. You found the smallest piece of it. Then tell us the rest, Julian said. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment, and Noelle watched the calculation finish behind her eyes, watched her decide, in real time, that this was not a room she was going to win in tonight. I have somewhere to be, Vanessa said, and picked up her phone from the desk, where she'd set it down without either of them noticing, and walked out of the office without another word, her heels sharp and unhurried against the hardwood, the sound of them fading down the hall, and then, a moment later, the front door closing behind her, with none of the soft, deliberate click Noelle had come to associate with this house. It shut hard. Neither of them moved for a moment. She's not just going to disappear, Julian said finally. No, Noelle said, she isn't, which means we need Preston on the phone tonight. And we need everything I have backed up somewhere she can't touch it. And we need to talk to the board before she gets ahead of this with her own version of events. Julian looked at her, and for the first time since the wedding night, since long before the wedding night, if she was honest with herself, he looked at her the way she remembered him, looking at her a year and a half ago, across a conference table, before any of this, before Augustus had asked her to walk away, and she had done it without telling him why. You built all of this yourself, he said, while you were sick, while I was gone. I didn't have a lot of other options. You could have told me sooner. Any of it. I tried to tell you what I could, when I could, she said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she expected. The rest wasn't mine to tell until I had it right. I wasn't going to hand you half a case and watch you decide I was unstable for bringing it to you. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him absorb that, the shape of the last 4 days rearranging itself in his mind into something that looked less like a woman with a hidden agenda and more like a woman who had been doing, alone and at real cost to her own health, exactly what his grandfather had trusted her to do. I need to call Preston, he said, and I need to call the board chair. Tonight, before she has a chance to get ahead of us. I already called Preston an hour ago, Noelle said. He's expecting your call. Julian picked up his phone and paused before dialing, looking at her for one more moment. In the quiet of the small office, the rose garden gone fully dark outside the window now, and something passed across his face that wasn't quite an apology yet, but was the first honest thing he'd shown her since she'd walked into that bridal suite 4 days ago and heard him tell her exactly whose bed she wasn't standing in. Chapter 5. The board convened on a Tuesday morning in the glass conference room on the 31st floor, the one with the view of the harbor that Augustus used to say was wasted on people who never looked up from their phones long enough to see it. And Vanessa Sloane walked in 11 minutes late, wearing the kind of composed, unbothered expression that told Noelle She'd had 4 days to build a version of events she still believed could hold. She was wrong about that, but she didn't know it yet. And there was something almost sad in watching her sit down at the far end of the table with her folder squared in front of her like a woman who still believed the numbers were on her side. Preston Ames sat beside Julian. Noelle sat on his other side, 7 months pregnant now, in a chair someone had brought in specially because the boardroom furniture hadn't been built with this in mind, and she noticed Vanessa noticed the chair, noticed what it meant that Noelle was sitting at this table at all, rather than being managed from somewhere outside it. Before we get to quarterly numbers, the board said an older woman named Diane Petrakis, who had known Augustus for 30 years and did not look like someone who enjoyed surprises. Mr. Cross has asked for time on an urgent matter. Julian stood. He didn't have notes in front of him, and Noelle understood, watching him, that he decided somewhere over the last 4 days that this needed to come from him directly, without a script, the way his grandfather used to say the truth should always be delivered, plainly, and by the person who found it. 7 months ago, a vendor account was created inside this company, he said. Faro Municipal Consulting. $300,000 has moved through it since. Authorized under credentials logged as mine. On a night I was in Singapore and could not have made that authorization myself. He let that sit for a second. The account resolves through 2 layers of holding companies to Holloway Dynamics. The room went still in the particular way. Rooms go still when something has just become permanent that wasn't permanent 30 seconds ago. That's a serious allegation, said a board member near the end of the table. Do we have documentation? We do, Preston said, and slid a folder down the table. Copies already prepared for each of them, independently verified through Ashcombe Advisory Partners Forensic Review, cross-checked against Cross Capital's own server logs. The authentication trail is unambiguous. Vanessa hadn't opened her folder yet. She was looking at Julian with an expression that had gone very carefully neutral. I'd like to hear from Vanessa directly, Diane said. Given her role in vendor authorization, I'm happy to address it, Vanessa said, and her voice, when it came, had recovered its old pleasant register entirely, smooth and unhurried, a woman who had clearly spent 4 days rehearsing exactly this moment. Faro Municipal Consulting is a compliance vendor I engaged for environmental work at the Wilmington facility. I don't dispute that the authorization shows under Julian's credentials. What I'd point out is that this same week, Mr. Cross entered into a marriage under circumstances his own attorney found concerning enough to file for annulment. I think it's worth this board asking whether the timing of these accusations, arriving from a woman with a financial incentive to discredit me and secure her position in this family, deserves the same scrutiny you're applying to a routine vendor contract. The annulment filing has been withdrawn, Julian said. I withdrew it myself once I understood who'd pushed it through in my absence and why. Because she convinced you too, Vanessa said, and for the first time her voice sharpened, the pleasant register slipping. Julian, I have run this family's affairs for 6 years. I built the systems this company runs on. I sat in this building until midnight, more nights than I can count, while your grandfather decided, year after year, that a director title was something he'd get to eventually, and eventually never came. I raised your household. I managed your calendar, your travel, your family's entire financial footprint, and I was never once offered so much as a line in an org chart that reflected what I actually did here. So before this board decides I'm the villain in whatever story she's telling you, I'd ask you to consider what 6 years of being indispensable and invisible does to a person. The room was silent for a moment, and Noelle watched something pass across a few of the older board members' faces, something that might almost have been sympathy, before Diane spoke again. That may well be true, Vanessa, Diane said, and if it is, it's a conversation this board should have had with you years ago. It doesn't explain a forged authorization and a shell account tied to our largest competitor. Vanessa's jaw tightened. Whatever she'd hoped that admission would do, it hadn't done it. Nobody suspected you until the numbers pointed there, Noelle said quietly. I didn't go looking for you specifically. I went looking for where $300,000 of this company's money had gone, because that's the job Augustus Cross hired me to do a year before I ever met his grandson. The trail led where it led. The motion is on the floor, Diane said. All in favor of authorizing a full internal investigation into vendor account irregularities and any associated information disclosure, with Mr. Ames's firm engaged as independent counsel. The vote went 11-1. Vanessa was the one. She gathered her folder, unopened, and walked out of the room, and this time nobody watched her go with any illusion that the fight was over. It wasn't. 2 days later, just after 7 in the evening, Preston called the house, his voice carrying an urgency. Noelle hadn't heard from him since the night she'd told him about the forged login. Thomas Reyes just called me, Preston said. The site manager at Wilmington, the one who'd have signed off on invoices for Pharaoh's supposed consulting work. Vanessa drove down there herself this afternoon, told him the whole thing was a misunderstanding that could still be cleared up quietly, offered him a consulting bonus, $15,000, if he'd sign a statement saying he'd personally overseen environmental work performed by Pharaoh at the facility. When he hesitated, she reminded him his son's tuition assistance program was administered through the same office that handled his performance reviews. Noelle felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with blood pressure. Is he all right? He's frightened. He's also smart enough to have recorded the conversation on his phone before he called me, because he said something about her tone made him not trust, leaving it his word against hers. Preston exhaled. She's not finished, Noelle. She still thinks there's a version of this where she walks out clean. Julian was already reaching for his jacket. Where is she now? According to Thomas, she told him she had a follow-up meeting at the Wilmington office tomorrow morning to, in her words, close the loop. I think she still believes if she can get that statement signed, the fraud case collapses back down to a filing error. They drove to Wilmington that night, Preston meeting them at a diner 2 blocks from the facility, and by morning, there were 3 people in the small back office of the Wilmington plant who hadn't been there the day before. Preston, a federal investigator from the SEC's regional office, who owed Preston a favor from a case a decade earlier, and Noelle, seated where Vanessa wouldn't see her until she was already in the room. Vanessa arrived at 9, in the same composed, unhurried way she always arrived anywhere, expecting Thomas Reyes and a signature and nothing else, and stopped hard in the doorway when she saw who was actually waiting for her. Ms. Sloan, the investigator said, standing, showing his credentials. We have a recorded conversation from yesterday afternoon in which you offered a cross-capital employee $15,000 to sign a false statement and referenced his son's tuition assistance in a manner that could be construed as retaliatory. Combined with the wire evidence already under review, that's witness tampering on top of wire fraud. I'd like you to come with us to discuss it properly. For a moment, Vanessa didn't move at all. Then her hand, the one holding her car keys, began to shake, just slightly. A small tremor she seemed to notice at the same moment Noelle did, and she closed her fist around the keys, as if that might stop it. This is a misunderstanding, Vanessa said, and her voice, for the first time in 6 years of Noelle, knowing her by reputation and 4 weeks of knowing her in person, did not come out smooth. It came out too fast, pitched slightly wrong. I was trying to protect a good employee from getting dragged into something that isn't his fault. That's all that was. You can explain that to counsel, the investigator said. Julian Vanessa turned to him, and whatever was left of the composure cracked open entirely, something desperate coming through underneath it. You know what I've done for this family. You know I would never actually hurt anyone in it. Tell them that. Julian looked at her for a long moment, and Noel watched him take his time with it, the way his grandfather used to take his time with things that mattered. I believe you built the wire scheme because you'd spent 6 years watching this family take you for granted, and somewhere along the way, that turned into believing you were owed whatever you could quietly take, he said. I even understand how that happens, but you went to a frightened man with a son in college and threatened his livelihood to protect yourself, whatever this family owed you. Vanessa, that's not a debt you get to collect that way. She had nothing left to say to that. She stood very still while the investigator read her the formal notice, her shoulders dropping by degrees the practiced posture she'd carried through 6 years of running this family's affairs finally giving out, and when they walked her out through the front of the Wilmington office, past a small cluster of staff who had gathered without quite meaning to, she did not look at any of them. The wire fraud and witness tampering charges were filed within the week. The SEC's parallel investigation into Holloway Dynamics moved fast enough that the hostile approach toward Cross Capital collapsed before it ever became public, a fact Noel only fully appreciated later. Reading the settlement terms, Preston walked her through, line by line, at the kitchen table at Larchfield, Julian across from her with 2 cups of coffee neither of them had touched. It cost Noel something too, and she made her peace with that slowly in the weeks that followed. Corrigan and Voss, the firm that had employed her for 6 years before any of this, called to say, carefully and with genuine regret, that her name was now attached to a case with too much public visibility for her to continue taking on independent forensic engagements under their letterhead, not because anyone doubted her work, but because every client going forward would wonder whether hiring her meant hiring a headline. She let the partnership lapse without much of a fight. It was a door closing on a version of her professional life she had built entirely on her own. Before any of this, before Julian, before Augustus, and she sat with the loss of it one evening at the kitchen table, longer than she let herself sit with most things, because some things deserve to be mourned honestly rather than rushed past. The real moment, the one Noel would remember longest, came on an ordinary Tuesday evening in late September, 3 weeks before her due date. When Julian found her in the nursery they'd finished setting up that month, sitting in the chair by the window with the lights off, watching the last of the light go orange over the hedge line. I owe you an apology, he said, from the doorway, and I've been trying for 2 weeks to figure out how to say it without it sounding like something I rehearsed. Then don't rehearse it, Noel said. Just say it. He came in and sat on the edge of the empty crib's assembly box, since the room didn't have a second chair yet, and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. The night we got married, I told you my secretary owned that bed. I said it because I'd spent 8 months letting someone else tell me who you were, and it was easier to believe her than to sit with the fact that I'd let you walk out of my life once already and never asked you why. He looked at his hands. I've thought about that a lot, about how much easier it was to be cold to you than to ask myself why the woman I'd fallen for 1.5 years ago had disappeared without a word, and why some part of me had spent that whole year telling myself I must have done something to deserve it. You didn't do anything, Noel said. Augustus asked me to go. He was afraid of exactly what almost happened, someone finding out what I was doing before I'd finished it, and it costing more than either of us could afford. I should have told you that instead of just leaving. That part was mine to own. I know why he did it now. Preston walked me through the whole clause last week. Julian looked up at her. I keep thinking about the fact that you carried all of this, the audit, the pregnancy, what happened at the hospital alone, in a house that was actively working against you, and you never once used any of it as a reason to give up on either of us. I thought about it, she admitted, more than once. Why didn't you? She was quiet for a moment, one hand resting against the tight curve of her stomach, feeling the small persistent movement that had become the most reliable comfort of the last several weeks. Because your grandfather trusted me with something before he trusted almost anyone else with it, and I wasn't going to prove him wrong just because it got hard, and because somewhere underneath everything Vanessa built, I still remembered what it was like sitting across a table from you a year and a half ago, before any of this, when you used to actually listen when I talked instead of deciding in advance what I meant. I'd like to be that person again, Julian said. I know I don't get to just say that and have it be true. I know it's going to take longer than a conversation in an empty nursery. It will, Noelle said, but I'm not going anywhere this time. I'm done disappearing to protect people from the truth. If we're doing this, we do it honestly, or we don't do it at all. Honestly, Julian said, and reached over slowly, the way a man reaches for something he isn't sure he's earned yet, and took her hand, and she let him. Oliver Augustus Cross was born on a Thursday morning in mid-October, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a set of lungs that made the entire maternity floor aware of his opinion about being born, and Julian was in the room for all of it, holding Noelle's hand through the parts that mattered, and staying quietly out of the way through the parts that didn't need him, which, she would tell him later, in the exhausted, laughing way new parents tell each other things, was exactly the right instinct for both. He held his son for the first time sitting in the chair by the window, the same kind of chair he'd once told her he found unbearable in his grandmother's room, and something in his face, when he looked down at Oliver, was unguarded, in a way Noelle had never once seen it be across a conference table, or a bridal suite, or a boardroom. He's going to hear about all of this someday, Julian said quietly. Vanessa, the company, what almost happened before he was born. He will, Noelle said, and when he does, I want him to hear that his mother didn't wait for anyone to believe her before she did the work anyway. He'll hear that, Julian said. He'll also hear that his father took too long to earn the right to stand next to her while she did it. Noelle reached over and rested her hand against Oliver's small, warm back, feeling him settle into the particular stillness of a newborn, finally out of the noise and into the quiet, and she thought, watching the two of them in the fading afternoon light, that whatever else this year had cost her, the career she'd built on her own and quietly let go of, the hospital nights, the boardroom, the year she'd spent carrying a secret nobody in that house had wanted her to carry, she had ended up exactly where Augustus Cross had always meant for her to end up, not managed, not decorative, not a witness to somebody else's life, just home, finally, in the truest sense the word had ever held for her, with a son who had no idea yet what it had taken to get him safely into a world that, for once, was going to tell him the truth about where he came from.